All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. So welcome back, everyone. Welcome back after the break. I hope everybody had a good spring break, meaning you had some time to enjoy your lives, but also spent a lot of time making sure that you were well situated for, the second half of the semester. It's really not the second half because we're at the 10th week, so we're about 6 weeks away from the end. So we are past the halfway point, so that's a good thing. You have a lot to look forward to as far as like the end and then beyond. But between now and the end, of course, there's a lot that needs to be handled, including several midterms, finals, papers, etc. Lots of stuff coming up, lots of stuff being piled up on you. I hope you acknowledge this prior to the break and kind of laid out a plan for yourself, made sure that you weren't backed into a corner as far as like not having enough time to take care of everything you need to take care of. But if you didn't, it's not over yet. You've got plenty of time to just kind of make a good plan for yourself. Make sure that you're optimizing all your time, using it to the best capacity possible, making sure everything's taken care of on top of enjoying your life a bit. But this is not the time to make that a priority. This is the time to make school a priority. This is what you signed up for. You want this to work out, make it work out. It'll be over in 6 weeks. You'll have a summer break. You'll regroup. You'll reboot. You'll be able to kind of filter out all the pain and whatever it is that you have to endure between now and the end to get everything done in the way that you need to get it done, which is like at the best level possible. You want to produce quality. You don't want to just get by. You want to make sure you're pushing yourself here to really like get yourself to improve beyond what you maybe are even think you're capable of at this point. Just like push as much as possible. It's about discovery. It's about figuring out what you're capable of. It's about realizing that you can be great, and always kind of working towards that. So make sure that you're doing that so that this all works out for you, because if not, then why are you here? It's like there's no point. Like you're just kind of here like you were in high school, where it's like, I'm just here because I have to be. That's not this. This is completely different. You've chosen to be here. Choose to make the best of it. All right. Is there anything you want me to talk about before I get into the material? So again, we have a second exam coming up Tuesday. Today we'll finish off the second part of the course. So pretty standard. I've already told you you should know what the exam is going to be on. It's going to be on chapters 5 through 8. And I think we've gone through most of the material thoroughly enough to the point where if you've been following the stuff, if you've been learning the stuff as I've been moving along, should be fine. Should work out just fine for you. Today we'll again top off the last part of the chapter 8, and then the ball will be in your court. So are there any questions you'd like me to address about anything? Alrighty. Then let's jump right into the material. So we've been talking about basically optimal decision making by firms and the models that we use in economics to sort of figure out how that's done in different competitive settings. In order to do that, we had to start in chapter 5 with setting up a framework to understand the costs that firms have to consider when they're making their decisions. In order to figure out costs, we have to establish the nature of production. So we talked about the general nature of production, the model that we have to explain it, both in the short run and in the long run. The short run being a period in which at least one input into production is fixed. That implies a lot about costs. There's a fixed cost, there's a variable cost. In the long run, that's not the case. So there's different ways of choosing the inputs into production that will optimize the firm's goals, which is to maximize their profits, differently in both the short run and the long run. We talked all about that in chapter 5. Make sure you understand all of it. Make sure you understand how to calculate everything we did in that chapter. Make sure you are able to do all the homework problems we did. Then chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 was like practical issues with respect to procuring inputs, getting the inputs that managers need to optimize their production mix so that they can lower their costs. We talked about some issues with respect to that. We talked about the principal agent problem, the issue of trying to align the interests of everybody involved in a firm. Not much was talked about there, but some things, so make sure you understand the terminology there. Chapter 7, we looked at the nature of industry. So we looked at sort of Gesundheit. We looked at just general kind of conditions that that give us an idea of like how different industries work differently and maybe result in different outcomes in the competitive range. Either the most competitive, which is the perfectly competitive market, which is the one we've considered so far in Chapter 8, all the way to the least competitive setting, which is the monopoly, in which there's only one market, only one seller in the market defining the market, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. So that chapter was about like very general stuff, dealing with just like the structure of a market, the conduct of a market, and the performance of a market given different characteristics. Make sure you understand all of that. Make sure you understand the measures we covered in those chapters to kind of give us an idea of how different markets differ from each other. And finally, we jumped into Chapter 8, started that off last time we met. We then took the framework of costs that we established in Chapter 5, and we started to compare it against the benefits of selling in markets, which is revenue, to figure out how firms are able to choose their optimal quantities, their pricing, and ultimately, maximize their profits, and sort of some different sort of situations that might arise from trying to do that maybe will result in them making losses, and how a firm might address problems like that, and how then that got us to the individual supply relationship for an individual firm, which wound up being the marginal cost of their firm above their minimum of their average variable cost, which I'll quickly review today. And then that got us to like a market supply for the perfectly competitive market. Anyway, so it's all very connected, and there's been a sort of a buildup, and now we're going to continue with that. And then Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 will deal with another market setting beyond the ones we're covering here that is the most common and is the most complicated Gesundheit to address, because there is interdependence in decision making. Decision making in those markets is not just based on internal conditions that are reflected by costs, and that in comparison to like the revenues that firms can earn in markets, but also like what are their rivals doing, like because they share markets in those settings with a few firms, and therefore they could work together, which means that they could earn the most profits possible, or they have to figure out to best compete against each other by taking into consideration what their rivals might do, which complicates the situation, which requires more sophisticated models to understand that kind of analysis, which is why we have a couple of chapters dealing with that. So that's what we'll cover right after the exam, and then we'll have a couple of last chapters, one dealing with special pricing issues that firms will be able to sort of address if they have market power, which is the ability to charge prices above their marginal costs. And the last chapter has to do with like issues of information, because we've assumed here that everybody has all the information they need, but in reality that's not the case. Like decisions that we wind up establishing are optimal are based on information that may or may not be available to a firm, and so we address some of those issues in the final chapter. So that's where we're heading. Again, it's all kind of connected and all kind of builds on itself. So there is definitely logic there that if you follow it, will help you to kind of be more in tune with the overall concepts and their importance, and ultimately provide ideally enough relevance for you to give you the motivation you need to really kind of try to get it down and learn it. And ultimately, this is important stuff, because even though like a lot of these models like present situations that are very specific, very simplified, they are like the base cases that could happen in business, so the most general cases that could happen. And therefore, the results that we gain from these models provide you your basic intuition about how things work. And then, in practice, whatever's happening in the real world will differ from what we predict here. But given that you understand how like the baseline case Gesundheit operates, then you can kind of, at least have that as a starting point of understanding of how to address issues that you may encounter in the real world. And then kind of build from that, use your other expertise from your other classes, use your own intuition and creativity to, get you to wherever you need to get. But like the stuff we cover here is like, it's important just to kind of give you that basic baseline kind of understanding of how things could possibly work. And it is likely also that you might encounter situations exactly as we consider. So that's also possible. So therefore, those will be clear cut. You've got the roadmap to how to deal with those situations with the stuff we're covering in this class. So there you go. All right. So today we're going to finish covering monopoly, which is what we started covering last time, and then we'll cover monopolistic competition, which is a hybrid of the most extreme side of the competitive spectrum, perfect competition, and the least extreme side of the competitive spectrum, which is monopoly. Alrighty. So previously in Econ 308, we covered perfect competition. Perfect competition is, again, the extreme side of the competitive spectrum where the markets are as competitive as they possibly can be. There's many buyers and sellers in the market, so nobody has any leverage over the market because everybody is basically competing against a bunch of other players, both on the supply and the demand side. Each firm in the market produces the exact same thing, a homogeneous product. Generally, we consider it a commodity. Commodities are very general goods. Generally, they're going to be the most general inputs into production, like steel, oil, just like raw materials, wheat. Things that firms cannot take and say, this is my own special version of this, and therefore I can charge more for it than my competitors. Everybody has to charge the same thing because everybody's selling the same thing, and there's no way to make it different. Buyers and sellers have perfect information. Everybody knows exactly what everybody else is doing, so nobody has any uncertainty about that. There's no transaction costs, the costs that we talked about in Chapter 6. And there is free entry and exit into the market. It's really easy for firms to enter and exit the market if they want to. If firms want to enter the market because there are profits to be made, they will. And there's nothing stopping them to do that. They can easily get a hold of the productive resources you need to produce in those markets, and therefore anybody can enter if they want to, which makes it, which makes the market as competitive as possible, which ultimately leads to a long-run equilibrium for these markets in which there is zero economic profit. And remember, we're talking about zero economic profit. We're talking about positive accounting profit because we are subtracting implicit costs of the capital being used to produce, which means that at least the firms are making what they would make if they were simply take those resources and invest them in markets and get some sort of basic return on them. All right, so in the perfectly competitive market, the individual firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. Everybody's a price taker. Nobody can affect the price. This is the actual market with a bunch of sellers, a bunch of buyers. That sets up the equilibrium price. This is the demand and supply framework that you've been studying from day one in your econ classes, including in this one. And so this is just taking the perspective of the firm, of that market, what they see as the demand in the market. And again, because they cannot affect the price, the demand is just a horizontal line. And they can only charge the price being set in the market. That means that the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units, the marginal revenue, is just equal to their price, and it is constant. They can't do anything about it. So the firms are looking to set their amount of output that's going to maximize their profits, the difference between their revenue and their costs. So revenue here is just a straight line because the marginal revenue, the extra revenue gained from selling additional units, which is also the derivative of the revenue curve, the slope of our revenue curve is constant. Therefore, our revenue curve is just a linear function of quantity. So the biggest distance between the cost curve, that The shape, again, reflects the stuff we talked about in Chapter 5. And revenue is going to happen at the point where profits are at their maximum. And it happens that at that point, the slopes of our costs and our revenue curves are equivalent, meaning that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Another way to look at the profit maximizing choice for a competitive market is just to look at instead of looking at overall revenues and overall costs, is to look at their perfectly elastic demand curve, which is also their marginal revenue curve, in relation to the marginal cost curve, which we got from Chapter 5. And of course, also we have our average total cost curve, the U-shaped curve here, which is crossed by the marginal cost curve at its minimum. So the perfectly competitive firm will set their profit maximizing output level at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals price for a perfectly competitive market, and therefore they set their optimal level of output at the point where marginal revenue or marginal cost equals price. So that's how they set their output, and then they figure out, well, how much does it cost me on average to produce at that level? Well, they go up to their average total cost curve at that quantity, and that tells them the average cost of production. The difference between the price and the average cost of production will be their profit. For that unit, multiplied by Q, the amount they're selling, is their overall profit that they are selling. So this firm is selling in a perfectly competitive market, optimizing their output by choosing the output that corresponds to the point where marginal cost equals price, and they are making a positive profit because their average total cost curve is below the price. They could be making a loss, though, if the average total cost curve at the point where their profit maximizing level exists is above the price. At that point, the firm will be losing money, and the question is, should it continue operating? Well, it depends on where their average variable cost curve, which is also the U-shaped curve, that's going to be below the average total cost curve. Marginal cost crosses it at its minimum as well. So in this case, the total revenues, the price times the quantity, exceed the amount that the firm is paying for their variable costs. So at the profit maximizing level of output, here is their average cost of their variable input, which is we consider to be labor in this class. So that times the quantity gets us the total variable cost, and we see that revenues cover that. That means that the difference between average total cost and average variable cost, which is average fixed cost, times the quantity, these are their fixed costs. Part of that are being covered by the revenues they're earning. And therefore, although they're making a loss, if they were to shut down, they'd have to cover the entire fixed cost, which means that they would be incurring a greater loss if they were to shut down in the short run. So in the short run, if the average variable cost curve is below the price, then even though the average total cost curve is above the price and the firm is making a loss, they should continue operating because at least they're covering their fixed costs. Yes? Yeah, so that's the next one that we already covered. This is just review stuff. You should have already gotten down. What's that? Yeah, here. So here's your average variable cost. It's above the price, and therefore price times quantity. This is revenues. They're not even covering the cost of labor. So here, if the average variable cost curve is above the price, that means the firm, if it were to shut down, only needs to pay for its fixed costs. Whereas if it continues operating, it needs to pay some of those variable costs out of pocket that are not being covered by the revenues. So when the average variable cost is above the price, then the firm should shut down in the short run if they're experiencing losses. If average variable cost is below, they should not. Which gets us to the short run output decision under perfect competition principle. To maximize short run profits, a perfectly competitive firm should produce in the range of increasing marginal costs, where price equals marginal cost, provided that price is greater than the average variable cost. If price is less than average variable cost, the firm should shut down its plant to minimize its losses. And then that principle got us to the firm's short-run supply curve. So here is the marginal cost curve. Here's the price. It could vary depending. Over here, there's a demand and a supply curve. And the demand and supply curve they're being shifted by various market powers, market forces that we talked about earlier in this course. You know, things are shifting supply, things are shifting demand that have nothing to do with the firm's costs, and therefore price is moving up and down. So the firm will not operate if the price falls below average variable cost, which happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it, which is the minimum point of average variable cost. But it will operate beyond that. And so therefore the firm's short-run supply curve is its marginal cost curve above the minimum of its average variable cost. So that's what we're looking at here. So that's the individual firm supply curve. And then we can get to the market supply curve, the one that we're all familiar with, the one that we've all been looking at the demand and supply framework since our first econ course, by doing a horizontal summation across each individual firm supply curve at varying prices. If we assume that all firms are the same, then this would be the marginal cost for every firm. At $12, each one is willing to supply one firm. If there's 500, each one is willing to supply one unit of output. If there's 500 firms, then at $12, 500 units will be supplied in the market. So this will be the market supply curve. All right, long-run decisions. In the long run, for perfectly competitive firms, if there are economic profits to be made, then firms will enter the market because there's free entry and exit. There are no barriers to entry. And so if there are economic profits being made, meaning that if the average total cost curve is below the price where their optimal level is chosen, then that will draw in other investors into the market to compete, which will shift the supply curve to the right, which will then lower the price. So if the price is above the average total cost curve, there will be enough entry where like that price will basically ultimately just be tangent, just touching the average total cost curve in which there's zero economic profit. So firms will enter, and that will happen to the price, which is the marginal revenue curve for the perfectly competitive firm. If firms are making economic losses, then in the long run, the firms will exit the industry, which means the supply curve will shift to the left, which means that equilibrium price will increase. And so the existing firms that remain in the industry will have their price go up above, the point where they're making losses, well, at least to the point where they're making zero economic losses. So in the long run competitive equilibrium for a perfectly competitive market will happen at the point where the price is equal to marginal cost, and also the price will be equal to the minimum of the average cost curve, which is in the long run, we just call it average cost curve because there's no fixed and variable costs. Everything's just variable. And so this is the long run equilibrium for all perfectly competitive firms. It happens at the point where average cost is minimized. So the average cost of production is minimized in these markets, which is the best outcome you can get. These markets are ultimately heading to the point where they are providing goods at the least cost possible, and basically getting us the best possible result from a market. It's the most efficient market. The welfare of all participants is maximized, meaning consumer and producer surplus is the best it possibly can be. This is the best market outcome that we can get. And again, it happens in the long run at the point where price equals marginal cost and price equals the minimum of average cost. All right, now let's go to the other end of the spectrum, monopoly, where things are not as efficient. Things are not as beneficial for everyone, but ultimately for the monopolists, very beneficial. So monopoly refers to a situation where a single firm serves an entire market for a good for which there's no close substitutes. They are the only firm in the market, and therefore the demand curve, the downward sloping demand curve in the market, is the demand curve they face. So that's one of the big differences between them and the perfectly competitive firm. They face that downward sloping demand curve, and therefore they can charge different prices. They're not price takers or price setters, but they can't just sell any quantity they want at any price. They are beholden to what people are willing to buy at those prices, right? So as they change their prices, they have to move along their downward sloping demand curve. Sources of monopoly power, we talked about a few of these. One is economies of scale. Economies of scale means that there are decreasing average costs in the long run. So basically, if firms are able to get big enough, then they're able to enjoy economies of scale. But there's also the situation where firms can get too big and therefore get into the range of increasing average costs in the long run, which is called diseconomies of scale, which means that they're getting too big and their average cost of producing are ultimately going to be going up if they get too big. But economies of scale will generally exist in some situations that will maybe result in even just one firm being the sole provider in the market. So here we have an average total cost curve. Here is the monopoly output. There's the demand curve. And this monopolist is able to operate profitably, but let's say another firm were to enter the market and they would have to share the market, so therefore they would have to divide up that quantity that they could sell. Each one would sell half of that quantity, which means they would be selling here, which means their average cost of producing would be here, which would be above the price they can charge, which means that they would be operating at a loss. And therefore, in some markets, it doesn't even make sense for there to be more than one firm. It's called a natural monopoly situation. In those situations, the government tends to regulate because obviously firms have a lot of power in those markets, and therefore, consumers can be hurt by that. And so, there's definitely enough framework in our government, at least for now, that protects consumers from those type of situations. Economies of scope, something else we talked about at the end of chapter 5, where firms benefit from producing things together. Their costs are less when they produce things together than when they produce them apart, which means that sometimes the situation may be so extreme that other firms would not be able to enjoy the cost benefits of producing things together because maybe they just want to produce one thing in the market. But if they just produce one thing in the market and not produce two things together, then they won't enjoy the economies of scope that a firm that produces things together gets to enjoy, and therefore they will not have the cost advantage and they will be priced out of the market. So if economies of scope are severe enough, that can lead to monopoly power. Same thing with cost complementarities, which was the other case we talked about at the end of chapter 5, where the extra cost of producing additional units, the marginal cost, goes down when things are produced together versus apart. We talked about the very obvious example of donuts and donut holes. There are cost complementarities there. Sometimes the case can be extreme enough where if firms aren't taking advantage of cost complementarities, then they will not be able to compete in markets and a monopoly may result. Another very obvious source of monopoly power is a legal barrier. It can be a patent. It can be just a government license. It can be a copyright. Whatever it is, it's basically a legal right to produce something that nobody else can produce. The legal right may be to produce like the actual product, or it may be a legal right to use the productive resources you need to produce a product that other firms may not be able to get a hold of, which are all barriers to entry, which stop firms from getting in. So essentially, all these things that I just talked about are barriers to entry. They stop other firms from getting in, which means that firms can just exist on their own, dominating the market, doing ultimately whatever they want in relation to their cost conditions, because ultimately they need to consider what their cost conditions are to figure out what they're going to be supplying in these markets. And of course, to figure out what you need to supply in the market, you need to consider what's the benefit of selling in the market. So what's the marginal revenue? It's the extra revenue of selling additional units compared to the extra cost, the marginal cost. Well, marginal revenue in perfectly competitive markets is constant. It's equal to price. Again, because the firms are price takers. A monopolist, not a price taker, faces a downward sloping demand curve. Therefore, their marginal revenue is going to be below the demand curve. And that is because as they maybe want to increase the quantity they sell, they can do that, but they have to lower the price on existing units. So if they were selling at this point here 100 units, 60 bucks, and they decide we want to sell more at 150 units, well, they have to lower the price to $50 because that's what the consumers want. They're beholden to the demand curve, and so they gain extra revenue by producing additional units. So we have here 50 units times 50, so that's additional revenue they gain, but they do lose some revenue off of the existing 100 units they could have sold at a higher price, which they had to lower the price of. So they lose, in this case, 100 times $10, so about $1,000 bucks. So their extra revenue they gain from selling additional units is not the price they can get from selling those additional units, but it's the price they can get from selling those additional units minus the loss they face from what we call the price effect of a price change versus the quantity effect. So in this case, the quantity effect outweighs the price effect. So that means that marginal revenue will be positive. So the firm will be operating along this range here, which means that revenues would be increasing along that range. Beyond that range, revenues will start going down when marginal revenue becomes negative. That happens because the price effect winds up being bigger than the quantity effect. Extra revenues gained from selling additional units do not outweigh the loss in revenues from lowering the price on existing units. And so that turns marginal revenue negative. And so firms operate over the range where marginal revenue is positive, but marginal revenue is less than price. Now, mathematically, when we're talking about linear demand curves, the slope of the marginal revenue curve is going to be twice as much as in absolute value as the slope of the inverse demand function. And so that's a really easy shortcut to get from your inverse demand function to your marginal revenue function. Just to put a 2 in front of the slope, that gets you to the marginal revenue function. Instead of taking your inverse demand function, multiplying it by quantity to get your revenue, and then taking the derivative to get your marginal revenue. That will get you to this as well, but this is a shortcut which you can easily take if you remember how to do it. We did a quick demonstration problem. That was the inverse demand function. And then we just doubled it to get the marginal revenue. So 10 minus 2q was the inverse demand function. Marginal revenue was 10 minus 4q. All right, now let us move on to the material that will tie up the second part of the course. All right, so now having understood what their costs are from Chapter 5, and now understanding what their marginal revenue is, we can figure out what the optimal point of supply is for a monopolist. Because again, in economics, to figure out how much decisions, how much of something one should do, we have to consider marginal values, the extra benefit of doing one additional unit, the extra cost of doing one additional unit. So that's what we do. So that's what the monopolist does. So again, just generally before we look at marginal, let's just look at again, profits overall based on overall costs and revenues. So profits are determined by both revenue and costs. Since the revenue a monopolist receives from selling Q units is, of course, price times quantity, the profits of a monopolist with a cost function, CQ, are just the difference between their revenues and their costs. Again, pi is equal to profit in economics. So here's typical revenue and cost functions. Again, here's that revenue function just up to the point where it's at its maximum. Beyond that point, marginal revenue becomes negative, and obviously the firm does not want to operate along that range. Here's the cost function. And so the firm is profitable at any output that lies within these 2 points here, between points B and A, where revenues are greater than costs. Profits are going to be, again, at their greatest, where the vertical distance between the cost and the revenue function are at their maximum. And at that point, once again, it happens to be that the slope of the revenue and the cost function are the same, so the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. But remember, for a monopolist, marginal revenue does not equal price. And therefore, the profit maximizing quantity for a monopolist is set at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, versus for a perfectly competitive firm, they set it at the point where their marginal cost equals price, because price equals marginal revenue. So again, at that point where profits are maximized, their profit maximizing output corresponds to the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is less than price. All right, so let's look at the same situation, but in the right way, in the way that's going to give us more information about like the firm's profits and how they're doing, and maybe like what kind of decision they should make in the short run in relation to their average total cost. So here's the demand curve. Here is the marginal revenue curve. Again, it's twice as steep as the inverse demand function, and therefore its intercept is going to be half as much as that of the demand curve. So there's a marginal revenue curve. Here's our swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve, again reflecting the fact that there's increasing returns to labor and then decreasing returns to labor. And so this is the point where the firm will optimize, meaning maximize their profits at the point where their marginal cost equals their marginal revenue. So the intersection of these two will dictate how much the firm will supply in the market. And then the next step for the monopolist is to figure out, well, how much should we charge at that level? So therefore, they then go up to the demand curve to see, well, how much are consumers willing to pay? So then that will tell them how much they should charge in the market. So again, they are not price takers. They have to set their price. So there's that extra step for them, whereas you don't have that with a perfectly competitive firm. They just take the price set in the market. They can't do anything about the price. They can't change the price. If they try to raise the price, they're priced out of the market. So yeah, so they set their optimal output by setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, then figure out the price by going up the demand curve to figure out what people are willing to pay for that. Then to figure out their profits, once again, we look at their average total cost curve. Here's the U-shaped average total cost curve. There's the minimum at the point where marginal cost crosses it. At the optimal point of supply, QM, the average total cost of production is this amount here, corresponding to that point on the average total cost curve. The difference between that point and the price being charged is profit for that unit, times the amount being sold is profits for the monopolist. So this monopolist is profitable because, once again, the average total cost curve is below the price, and therefore profits are being made. All right, so that just gets us to the monopoly pricing rule, just kind of summarizing everything I just said. Given the level of output QM that maximizes profits, the monopoly price is the price on the demand curve corresponding to QM units produced. All right, demonstration problem, just kind of highlight the math behind this approach for the monopolist to solidify the logic for you. So suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolist product is given by P of Q equals 100 minus 2Q. And the cost function is given by 10 plus 2Q. Determine the profit maximizing price and quantity and the maximum profits. All right, so what is the profit maximizing condition that the monopolist needs to follow in order to maximize their profits? They need to set something equal to something. What? Those, not those. Marginal revenue equal to, okay, what is the marginal cost here? It's 2, right? It's a derivative of our cost function. What is this 10 here? It's a fixed cost. What is this? That's our variable cost, right? All right. What is the marginal revenue function here? Of what? 100 minus 4Q is correct. It's not the derivative because this is our inverse demand function. So you would need to multiply it by Q to get the total revenue, then take the derivative. But if you remember our shortcut, to get to the marginal revenue, you just double the slope and absolute value. Yeah. Just the slope, the coefficient on the variable. Yeah. All right, so that will get us to our marginal revenue. So we set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. So our marginal revenue is 100 minus 4Q. Our marginal cost is equal to 2. So now it's just simple algebra. Subtract 100 from both sides, divide both sides by -4. That gets us to the profit maximizing quantity for this monopolist to be 24.5 units. All right, so now how are we going to get the price that they should charge for that amount? Yeah, into our inverse demand function. Yes, exactly. So now the monopolist will just plug in their profit maximizing quantity into their inverse demand function to get the price. So plugging in 24.5 there, doing a little bit of math, gets us to a price of $51. So the firm knows to charge $51 for the amount. All right, and now we're just going to look at profits. Profits are a standard calculation of profits. Price times quantity is revenue minus the cost of producing the optimal quantity, 24.5. So price $51, quantity 24.5 minus 10 minus 2 times 24.5, which is 51. That's going to get us to a profit of 1190.5. Any questions on this? All right. Yeah. No. All right. So a monopolist does not have a supply curve like an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market does, where again, it is their marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost. That's not the case for monopolists. So a supply curve in general determines how much will be produced at a given price. A monopolist determines how much to produce based on marginal revenue, which is less than price. So there's no way to express how a monopolist quantity choice would change for different given prices. So there's no supply curve for a monopolist. There's no clear relationship between price and quantity. There's a rule they follow, and that is to set their marginal revenue equal to their marginal cost. And that's how they set their quantity. So there's a relationship between marginal revenue and quantity, but there isn't a relationship between price and quantity, which can then establish a very clear-cut supply curve. So that, again, highlights the fact that the markets that we've been studying very generally at the start of this course with demand and supply do not reflect like the less competitive markets, those that have monopoly power or market power, the ability to charge prices above their marginal cost. And so, the situation is a little bit more complicated in those markets. And this is a characteristic of all markets served by firms with market power, such as monopolistic competition, which we'll talk about in a bit. All right, quick application, multi-plant decisions. We've assumed that the monopolist produces output at a single location. In many instances, a monopolist has different plants at different locations. So an important issue for the manager of such a multi-plant monopoly is the determination of how much to produce at each plant. So they could have a plant in the United States and then a plant in like Latin America. That means that they'll have different costs, right? They'll have, different wages that they pay out. So the cost for producing will be different. But again, there are those standard sort of characteristics of production that all firms have to face, which, are diminishing returns to labor when, they fix their input, when they fix some input, which is generally their capital of some form. So ultimately, the marginal cost will be equivalent at some level for them, which will ultimately be equal to the marginal revenue in the market. And that's ultimately what they need to do. So if we suppose a monopolist produces output at 2 plants, let's say the cost of producing Q1 units at plant 1 is just the cost of that. And the cost of producing Q2 units at plant 2 is the cost of that. So they have different cost functions for the different plants, which is denoted by the subscripts. And they have different quantities produced at the different plants, denoted by the subscripts. Also, suppose the products produced at the 2 plants are identical. So the price per unit customers are willing to pay for total output produced at the 2 plants is just the price that consumers are willing to pay in that market. They're selling the things being produced at the 2 plants are exactly the same. The only thing that differs is the cost of producing. And so the quantity sold in the market is just a sum of the quantity produced in each plant. Profit maximization implies that the 2-plant monopolist should produce output in each plant such that the marginal cost of producing in each plant equals the marginal revenue of total output. So that's our principle, our multi-plant output rule. Let marginal revenue be the marginal revenue of producing a total of Q units. Suppose the marginal cost of producing Q1 units is some marginal cost, and the marginal cost of producing Q2 units is some marginal cost associated with that second plant. The profit maximization rule for the 2-plant monopolist is to allocate output among the 2 plants such that the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost in the first plant, and the marginal revenue is also equal to the marginal cost in the second plant. So the underlying, the economic intuition underlying the multi-plant output rule is precisely the same as all other profit maximizing principles. Basically, if the marginal cost is below marginal revenue, then they need to produce more because there's a benefit to producing more. So if at one plant they again are at the point where they are producing and their marginal cost is less than marginal revenue, they should produce more at that plant, even if marginal revenue equals marginal cost at the other plant for that same quantity. So what this implies is that the marginal costs are going to be equal across both plants at the optimal selection of output production in each plant. Quick demonstration problem. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolist product is given by 70 minus 0.5Q. The monopolist can produce output in 2 plants. The marginal cost of producing in plant 1 is 3Q1, and the marginal cost of producing in plant 2 is just 1Q2. How much output should be produced in each plant to maximize profits, and what price should be charged for the products? Well, we could set our marginal costs equal to each other, but we're setting 2 expressions equal to each other that have different variables. We have 2 variables to solve for. The output in plant 1, the output in plant 2. When you have 2 variables to solve for, you need 2 equations. All right, so to maximize profits, the firm should produce output in the 2 plants such that they set their marginal cost in each plant equal to the marginal revenue. What is our marginal revenue function here? 70 minus Q, very good. We're just doubling the slope on our in absolute value on our inverse demand function. So we'll set that equal to the marginal cost in each of our plants. In the marginal revenue equation, we will separate first the quantity into our 2 quantity variables because the quantity being sold in the market is going to be the sum of the output produced in the 2 plants. So that'll get us 2 variables that we need to solve for. So we'll have one expression setting marginal revenue up equal to marginal cost from plant 1, and also another one setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost in plant 2. And there's our 2 equations that we need to solve for our 2 outputs. 2 equations, 2 unknowns, that's what you need. So now it's just a system of equations and algebra. So on this one over here, I just distributed this out. This is 70 minus Q1 minus Q2 there. Then I added Q1 to both sides and subtracted 70 from both sides. Divide both sides by -1. That means Q2 is equal to 70 minus 4Q1. So that's always what you need. You need to solve for one variable in terms of another. Then you plug it into the second equation. So plugging equation 2 into equation 3 for Q2, so you're going to plug that in twice there. Or you could solve for Q2 first before doing that, but whatever. Doesn't matter which one you do first. So Q1 plus 70 minus 4Q1, so that's what we have here, equals Q2, which is 70 minus 4Q1. So now we have an expression with just Q1. Now you just need to solve for Q1. 70 minus 70 is 0. You've got Q1 minus 4Q1. That's equal to negative 3Q1. But there's a negative there, so that's equal to positive 3Q1. So positive 3Q1, and then 70 minus 4Q1 on the right there. That's what we have. And then just divide both sides by... we're going to add 4Q1 to both sides. That's 7Q1 on the left. Divide both sides by 7. And that's going to get us to the optimal amount the firm should produce in plant 1 to be 10 units. And now you've got that. Just plug it into any equation that relates both variables. Number 3 is the simplest one. So plugging that value into 3 will get us the amount that the firm will need to produce in plant 2. So producing 10 units in plant 1, 30 units in plant 2 will maximize its overall profits, given that it is a monopolist and it is able to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, marginal revenue being less than price. How do we solve for price here? The price that they need to charge in this market. So where do we generally get price? Plug what in? Separately? Together, right? They produce the same thing. They produce a total of 40 units. You plug in 40 units into your inverse demand function to get the price, right? 50 bucks. That's what they should charge. All right, implications of barriers to entry. So again, there are certain things that don't allow other firms to get into the market. We talked about those things at the beginning when I reviewed. And because of that, if a monopolist is earning positive economic profits, the presence of barriers to entry prevent other firms from entering the market to reap a portion of those profits. So unlike in a perfectly competitive market where if a firm has their average total cost below the price at the optimal quantity they select and therefore are making economic profits in the short run, there's nobody to come into the market, shift that supply curve, lower the price to erode those profits. Therefore, those profits persist into the future. The only thing that could change is demand conditions, or maybe even their own cost conditions that might lead to a different outcome. But if nobody can come in to the market to compete against them, then ultimately the profits that they earn can persist in the long run. So monopoly profits, if they exist, will continue over time so long as the firm maintains its monopoly power. Again, they may not exist. Like the average total cost curve may be up here somewhere, in which case there may be losses, and the firm would decide whether to continue operating or not in the short run, depending on where their average variable cost curve is relative to the price. So again, the presence of monopoly power does not imply positive economic profits. It depends on where the demand curve lies in relation to the average total cost curve. The monopolists here earned zero economic profits because the average total cost curve is just tangent, just touching their demand curve at the point corresponding to the level of output that maximizes their profits, which again is selected by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So at that level, the price is actually equal to their average total cost, and therefore there are zero economic profits for this monopolist. But again, that means they're making positive accounting profits. Now, of course, there is a problem with the fact that there is a monopolist, the fact that they are setting prices above their marginal cost, and that is that they are not allowing certain mutually beneficial transactions from occurring. So the monopoly power a monopolist enjoys often implies some social cost to society. For simplicity, these curves are graphed as linear functions of output, so we just assume that there's decreasing returns from marginal cost. Just to highlight the nature of the losses, we've simplified that. And the position of the average cost curve is suppressed for now. We don't need to look at it for now. The first thing to notice about monopoly is that price exceeds marginal cost. The price in a market reflects the value to society of an additional unit of output. The marginal cost reflects the cost to society of the resources needed to produce an additional unit of output. And therefore, the price is above that. So society values the unit more than what it costs to produce, which means that we could do better. We could produce a lot more, but the monopolist chooses not to because that's the point that benefits them the most. So price above marginal cost means the monopolist produces less output than is socially desirable. So given the same demand and cost conditions, a firm in a perfectly competitive industry would operate at the point where price equals marginal cost. So they would operate at this point there, which means that the corresponding industry output in the competitive industry would be this much here. So under a monopolist, there's going to be less produced, less transacted. People that could buy and want to buy will not be able to because, again, the monopolist is limiting the amount that's being supplied in the market in order to keep prices high and maximize their own profits. So the monopolist produces less output and charges a higher price than would a perfectly competitive industry. That results in what we call deadweight loss, which is loss in surplus, consumer and producer surplus. So that's represented by this triangle here, the difference between the monopoly price and the marginal cost of producing times the and then so that's the height of the triangle, and the that's the base of the triangle, and then the height is equal to the difference between the quantities. I won't expect you to calculate it, but just so you know, you can calculate it. And that is deadweight loss. So the welfare loss to society due to the monopolist producing output below the competitive level. So this is just very sort of simplified way to highlight the fact that markets are hurt by market power. This is what we call an example of market failure, where the markets aren't doing the best they possibly can. But as far as the firms go, obviously it benefits them. So there is some benefit because profit can be thought of as also welfare for society overall, because those that profit from monopoly are part of society. But again, they are imposing a cost to society in order to benefit in that way. All right, finally, let's talk about monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is a market structure that lies between the extremes of monopoly and perfect competition. This market structure exhibits some characteristics of both perfect competition and monopoly. So let's look at the conditions for this type of market. An industry is monopolistically competitive if there are many buyers and sellers. So that's the first difference between it and a monopoly. In a monopoly, there is only one seller. And it's the first common trait that it has with perfectly competitive markets, again, meaning that there are a lot of sellers, again, like there are in perfectly competitive markets. Each firm in the industry produces a differentiated product. So unlike in a competitive market where everybody sells the exact same thing, in a monopolistically competitive market, everybody sells a slightly different version of the same thing. In these markets, there's free entry and exit from the industry. So again, like in perfectly competitive markets, if firms want to compete in these industries, they can. They have access to all the resources they need to enter the market, set up shop, and start competing. Obviously, not the case with a monopoly. So this is a trait shared with the perfectly competitive industries. So there's numerous industries in which firms produce products that are close substitutes, and the market for hamburgers is a prime example. So that's sort of the main sort of characteristic of these markets. Everybody makes a slightly different version of what everybody else is selling. Burgers are burgers ultimately, but we don't really think of them as just burgers anymore because, you know, In-N-Out makes their double-double. McDonald's makes their Big Mac. Burger King makes their Whopper. Ultimately, bread, lettuce, tomato, meat. It's a hamburger. But with their advertising and ultimately what we call brand equity, our belief in the brand as being something different than just like a generic version of the product, they are able to kind of create the idea in consumers' minds that they have a market that's sort of a sub-market of the overall market. So the demand curve they face is sort of a demand curve for their own version of the product being sold, and therefore they face a downward sloping demand curve just like a monopolist does. It's also relatively easy for new firms to enter the market for burgers. So over time, we see that there's just like more and more different types of burgers being sold by different types of burger joints because, again, it's easy for firms to enter and there are profits to be made there, and that lures more competitors in. But again, for the competitors to thrive, they have to have their own version of like the same thing. The key difference with the model of perfect competition is that each firm produces a product that slightly differs from the other firm's products. The products are close but not perfect substitutes. So for perfectly competitive markets, the consumers just view everything as exactly the same. You try to charge a penny more for the thing that everybody else is selling, I'm going to buy it from your competitor because everybody's selling the exact same thing. But when products are not perfect substitutes, in my mind, as a consumer, I may view the Big Mac as a different type of burger, something special versus the Whopper. And so I will be willing to pay a little bit more for the Big Mac. But if the Big Mac price is raised enough, I will jump ship and buy the Whopper because ultimately they are the same thing. So people aren't as beholden to the products as they would be for like a monopolist who is only able to sell the product. Nobody else is able to sell it. They will jump ship if prices are raised too high. So that's the imperfect substitute quality that's resulting in that. The fact that products are not perfect substitutes implies that each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve for its product, which looks more like the demand for a monopolist product. So that's where they share that important characteristic. There are two important differences between a monopolistically competitive market and a market serviced by a monopolist. While a monopolistically competitive market faces a downward sloping demand for its market, there are other firms in the industry that sell similar products. So that's a big one because that means that they do have to compete and they can ultimately have their profits be eroded. In a monopolistically competitive industry, there are no barriers to entry, which means that if profits are being made, firms will enter the industry and that will erode profits in the long run. That implies that in the long run, like in a perfectly competitive market, there will be zero economic profits as well. So again, that implies that firms will enter the market if existing firms earn positive economic profits. Profit maximization. So profit maximization for a monopolistically competitive firm happens exactly the same way as for a monopoly. So the determination of the profit maximizing price and output under monopolistic competition is precisely the same for a firm operating under monopoly because they do have their own demand curve. Yes, it is a demand curve that's very similar to the demand for their competitors, but it is theirs because, again, their product has been, whether through actual means or maybe through psychological means, given the idea in consumers' minds that they are different and therefore they have their own demand. If they have their own demand, it's downward sloping. They can charge different prices, but again, they're beholden to what people are willing to pay for those for the goods. So they're again kind of constricted by the downward sloping demand curve, and also they have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve for the same reason as a monopolist. So they set their optimal output at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and then to set their price, they go up to the demand curve to figure out how much folks are willing to pay for the profit maximizing level of output. And if average total cost is below the price, then there are profits for them as well. So that's, again, just summing up is the profit maximizing principle rule for monopolistic competition. To maximize profits, a monopolistically competitive firm produces where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The profit maximizing price is the maximum price per unit that consumers are willing to pay for the profit maximizing level of output. So it's the price at that optimal level of output. Since the firms in a monopolistically competitive industry produce differentiated products, the notion of an industry or a market demand curve is not well defined. So in Chapter 4, we looked at the rational consumer choice model. We looked at the optimal consumption bundle and how that changed when prices changed, and we were able to use that information to get to an individual person's demand curve, which then, taking various individual people's demand curves that result from the interaction of their budgets with their preferences, doing horizontal summation across those will get us to a total market demand curve. But in a monopolistically competitive market, this person is buying the Whopper and this person is buying the Big Mac, and therefore you can't really compare the two and say, well, there's a market for burgers, because really the thing being sold is slightly different from what everybody else is selling. So in monopolistically competitive markets, each firm produces a product that differs from other firms' products. Adding up these different products would be like adding up apples and oranges. So there really isn't no market demand curve because, again, they are kind of creating their own sub-niche markets by creating the idea that what they're selling is different from what their competitors are selling. All right, quick demonstration problem to highlight the logic of the math underlying the approach of the monopolistically competitive firm. Suppose the inverse demand function for a monopolistically competitive firm's product is given by 100 minus 2q, and the cost function is given by 5 plus 2q. Determine the profit maximizing price and quantity and the maximum profits. So what do we do here to do that? For a monopolistically competitive firm, we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. All right, what's the marginal revenue? 100 minus 4q. What's the marginal cost? 2. Same thing as before because they do exactly what a monopolist does. So 100 minus 4q equal to 2. Do a little bit of math. That gets us to the same quantity as before, 24.5. The profit maximizing price is found by setting our quantity at that optimal level, 24.5, just like a monopolist, which gets us to the same price as a monopolist, $51. And, of course, profits are, once again, revenues minus costs, which, again, if you just throw in the numbers, gets us to the same profits. So exactly the same as a monopolistic competition as far as like setting their output, setting their price, calculating profits. All right, long-run equilibrium. Suppose a monopolistically competitive firm that sells some brand X faces an initial demand curve D naught, and it has a marginal revenue associated with it. Since this demand curve lies above the average total cost curve, there's going to be economic profits made by this firm. So this is a situation where in the short run, again, the firm sets their output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at their price, at the price that people are willing to pay for their output, and the average total cost is below the price, so there will be profits. Those profits will lure in other competitors. Different types of burgers will enter the market. Different type of burger joints will enter the market, compete with the burger seller. And so as far as like demand goes, what's going to happen is like there's going to be extra firms entering the market, so there's going to be now more substitutes available for consumers to buy, and therefore that will shift the demand curve to the left. At any given price for this particular brand of burgers, people are going to buy less because there are now substitutes for it. There's more substitutes available for it. So that process will happen to the point where the demand curve will shift as additional firms enter the market to the point where it is just tangent to the average total cost curve. So it'll shift to the left to the point in the long run where the point where that marginal revenue associated with that shifted demand curve, which is this red marginal revenue one here, where that marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's how it will set its profit maximizing level in the long run, which means that the price it can charge based on the red demand curve is exactly equal to the average total cost of producing at that price, which means that there's zero economic profits in the long run. So in the long run, like in a perfectly competitive market, there are zero economic profits, as I mentioned already. So the long run equilibrium in a monopolistically competitive industry means that each firm earns zero economic profit but charges a price that exceeds the marginal cost of producing the good. So they earn zero economic profits, but again, you do have that deadweight loss situation because monopolistically competitive firms have market power, will charge a price above what it costs them to produce, which again is inefficient for society because there are mutually beneficial transactions that could occur if price was set equal to marginal cost. So that sums up the long run for the monopolistically competitive firm, this principle. In the long run, monopolistically competitive firms produce a level of output such that price is greater than marginal cost, but price is equal to average total cost, but that price is going to be greater than the minimum of the average cost. So that's another difference that we see with monopolistically competitive firms in the long run. Even though they make zero economic profits, they do not produce a quantity that minimizes the average cost of production. So that's also sort of a cost that we as a society have to be comfortable with. Firms do not take full advantage of economies of scale. They do not minimize their average cost of production in the long run. There's just too many firms in the industry to enable any individual firm to take full advantage of economies of scale in production. There's just no way for any individual firm to get big enough to operate at that level where they minimize the average cost of production. Some argue that this is simply the cost to society of having product variety. It's sort of what we are all willing to accept, or else like we would have to just buy one version of everything. Ultimately, maybe we could somehow collectively get to some consensus about that, but unlikely given, how fickle and different we all are. So therefore, we are willing to accept some costs. Even though we don't think about it, we understand that we sometimes are paying more for something that's slightly different than everybody else because that's just our preference. And so that is a trade-off that we face, and it's an important one that is, again, a result of having this type of market. But this is obviously a more sort of common setting that you would find than like a perfectly competitive market or a monopoly. So this is obviously something we see more in the markets that all of us sort of engage in on a daily basis. And then the other most common market is the oligopoly, which again we'll talk about post the second exam. So quick discussion about the implications of product differentiation. The demand for a firm's product is going to be less elastic when consumers view other firms' products as poor substitutes for it. So demand, obviously we have perfectly elastic demand in competitive markets. So you're going to have less elastic demand in these monopolistically competitive markets. People will be less sensitive to price changes because, again, they're more beholden to their type of the version of whatever they're buying that they like. So the less elastic the demand for a firm's product, the greater the potential for earning profits. Thus, many firms in monopolistically competitive industries continually attempt to convince consumers that their products are better than those offered by other firms. Firms in monopolistically competitive industries employ two strategies to persuade consumers that their products are better than those offered by competitors? First, of course, they spend considerable amounts on advertising campaigns. They employ comparative advertising, which is designed to differentiate a given firm's brand from the brand sold by competing firms in order to generate brand equity, the additional value that a brand adds to the product. Second, firms in monopolistically competitive industries frequently introduce new products into the market to further differentiate their products from other firms. These include not only new improved products as well as completely different product lines. Monopolistically competitive firms may also attempt to create and advertise new products that fill special needs in the market via what's called niche marketing that involves products or services targeted to a specific group of consumers. Such as like environmentally conscious folks. So green marketing is an example of niche marketing in which firms create and advertise environmentally friendly products in an attempt to capture the segment of the market that is concerned with environmental issues. Unfortunately, successful differentiation and branding strategies sometimes make managers myopic. They may just get too caught up in like what they think is the sort of the product that everybody wants and may not really see the forest for the trees, seeing that the forest is changing. You know, there was a time period where people weren't environmentally conscious. Then there was a time period in which they were. That means that as a manager, you should be aware of that and want to, you know, change your brand. So the problem is that managers sometimes become brand myopic. Myopia is just nearsightedness. Again, not seeing the forest for the trees. A brand myopic manager is satisfied with an existing brand, is slow to launch new products, and is not aware of emerging industry trends or change in consumer preferences. So it's a trap that you will want to not fall into. Always, it's important to keep an open mind about how different tastes and preferences are changing in society and adapt to that in order to continue thriving in these types of industries. All right, folks, we are done with this chapter. We are done with the second part of the course. So my part is done here. Now it's your part. I want you to come here on Tuesday and show me what you got. I want to see some really strong performances across the board. And that's it. I hope you have a really great couple of days, and I will see you on